Holy Father, thank you for this time you've given us to come together as your people. Forgive us for our shortcomings and weaknesses. But thank you for another day of life, another week that you let us go through. We ask that you help us to enter into that rest, that we might feel at peace and have the serenity that we need, Lord, to be able to sustain us in our darkest moments. Forgive us for our faults and trespasses and cover us with grace as you fill us with your presence. And I ask that you will comfort those that have lost a loved one this week. We know that there's many lives that have been lost this year, and we ask that you will comfort all those families that have lost someone as well. And so abide with us now, Lord. Bless this service. May it bring honor and glory to your name. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Okay, so we're picking up this week from where we left off last week. And if you can remember that, we'll go through a review of just the highlights of it. But we were talking about the idea that God's children in this world are different. And we're going to be looking at that some more as we go through this in more details about how we're different from the world. But that's really going to be a main focus here of what we're looking at, is how we're different. So looking back in review of what we covered last week in the verses that we looked at, those verses came from Matthew 17, 24 to 27. And as you might remember, that was talking about a miracle that Jesus did that no one ever remembers. And that's the one about the fish with a coin in its mouth. And the whole point of that, it was a teaching miracle. It wasn't for people to see and understand who Jesus was, like so many of the other miracles were. This one was a teaching for Peter, something that he needed to learn. And so from those verses, we're going to pick out two things that we're going to carry on into the lesson today. And that is, these are two things that Jesus said. The one was the children are free. And he's talking about free in the context of taxes, because that's a particular incident that was happening there. And we're going to see that there's more to it than that. And then he also says, but lest we give offense to them. And he's talking about offending the tax collectors by not paying them. And so what he's saying there is that it's necessary not to offend them, so the tax is going to be paid. And so those are the 2 points that we're going to carry through. The idea is that we are not bound by at least the tax laws, and we'll look at more than that, that are made by men. Nonetheless, we pay them for the reason that it's just going to cause trouble if we don't. So we pay them to make things go smoothly. And we'll look at all of these things in more detail as we go along. So those are the two key points. Jesus said that the children are free. And so one of the questions that we asked last week, and we're bringing up again this week, is who are the children? And also, what are they free from? And so we're going to see as we go into this some more, who the children are more clearly, evidence for that. But I'll just tell you in advance that the children is all believers, people who are believers of God, who are members of the kingdom of God. Those are the children. And what are they free from? We're going to find out that they are free from everything. All of the rules that mankind makes are not binding on the children of God. And that goes back to what Jesus was saying. He was basically saying that the children of God are now not bound by the tax laws. And that was his evidence there. And he paid the tax, not by himself, not from his own funds, but God provided from a fish, a coin to pay the taxes. And so we'll dig into these more in detail as we go along. They're just reviewing at the moment. So in the end, the tax was paid, and Jesus said that we're going to pay that tax so that we don't offend the tax collectors. And offending the tax collectors would have meant that the tax collectors would have gone to the Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers would have grabbed you up and dragged you off into prison. And so that would have made Jesus' work kind of unproductive. So those are the things that we're going to be looking at as we go along here. And the focus point of all of this is, who are we as children of God among mankind? We are different. How are we different? And it's going to be very important to us throughout our lives to understand how different we are, and that we are not like the rest of the world. We tend to look in a mirror and see ourselves looking like any other man, but we're not. God sees us very differently. And because of that, there are significant differences in perspective at least, and also sometimes in practical matters. And we'll see some of those as we go through this as well. So that's where we finished off last week, and we're continuing on this week. So who are the children? I already said they're all the believers in God. And what are they free from? Now, Jesus referred to taxes. That was his specific point. And this miracle had come about because God wanted Peter to learn something, to understand more deeply that Jesus wasn't just a man, that he was something much more than that. And that, in fact, it's not just Jesus, it is all of the children of God are in that same position, where they are very different from the world. They look like the world, but inside they're different. And so while Jesus was referring to taxes, we can see that taxes wouldn't have been the only thing that would have been involved here. All of the laws of man would be applicable here. So nothing that man makes for a law is binding on us. We do it because God has said that we should do it. And so this gives us, we've talked many times about the situation that you can run into when you have bad leaders who call on you to do evil things. And that happened in biblical times. We see cases where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel all ran into that problem of having to choose between what God said and what man said. And so this kind of gives us a better understanding of that. Is what man said was never binding on us. What's only binding on us is what God says. And so we are not offending God by ignoring our leaders when they are calling on us to do things that are against God. They were never our rulers either. God is our rulers. And so that makes it a little clearer about why it's possible for us to reject when men tell us to do things that are evil. Now I'm going to go a little off track here. And the point is that that's a bit of a fine line sometimes. We can sometimes claim that mankind is requiring us to do something evil when it's a little bit iffy there, and we're kind of using it as an excuse to ignore God's authorities, the people he set in place, when we shouldn't be. So we have to be very careful about that, I think. And there's one situation in current times where there's a person who says that he's going to ignore what the authorities have told him to do because he feels that that's against God. And I think it's an iffy situation there. So we need to be careful there. But yes, the truth is that the laws of man were never binding on us, only God's laws. And we'll understand more of that as we go along here. So Jesus, like I said that the tax is going to be paid. And so we do the same thing. We pay our taxes and we follow the laws of man because we respect the authority that God has given them. Not for any other reason, not because they are our leaders, they are in charge of us, but because God has said we are to do that. And that perspective is an important thing that we're going to be clearing up here and hopefully getting a better understanding of who we are as God's children in this society. And I think once you understand that a little better, it'll give you a different understanding of a different perspective on life and a lot of aspects of life. Okay, so, and also last week we asked the question is, are the children really free? Jesus said we don't have to pay the taxes, but we're going to pay the taxes. So is it real or an illusion? Is it just something that you can say, well, we're free, but we're going to pay the law or follow the laws anyway? And so if you're free from the laws of man, but you obey them anyway, is there any real difference? And the answer to that is yes. As I've been saying, perspective on who we are is a very important thing here. Understanding who we are as God's children and that we're not like the children of the world is an important distinction and one that we need to keep clear in our heads. I think a lot of Christians kind of think of themselves as a part of human society when they should be thinking themselves in a different way and from looking at things from a different perspective. And that's a perspective we're going to try and get to as we understand more and more about how different we really are and the evidence there is in the Bible that talks about how different we are. So one thing that becomes clear right away is that you can obey men in two different ways. And you can obey them like the world does. You obey them because they are your authorities, because you obey those men who are in authority. But for us, it should be different. Our perspective is different because we obey God who authorized those men. That's why we obey them. And so that might seem like a small difference, but it's a mind-changing difference when you understand it, that you aren't doing it because those men ordered you to do it. You're doing it because God said you should obey them. With the distinction that we already talked about, that if they tell you to do evil things, you don't do those things because God is your leader, not them. And so between those two ways that you can obey men, you choose who you serve, whether you're serving men or whether you're serving God. And that distinction is important in understanding who you are as God's children. So there are some practical effects, and we'll look at that in some examples here of things that are different in your real life because of this difference in who you are as a child of God. And we'll plumb that more as we go along here. And we're going to start right away. Well, not right away, in a second, I guess. So some things changed when we became children of God. And we know a lot of those things, and I'm not going to discuss those. We're really focused today on the differences between how we are as children of God in the world than the people who are in the world. And so just those differences are what we're going to look at here. And there are some one-time changes, some things that happen as you become a child of God. And so in that transition, some things happen that make you different. And there are also other things that are changes that will continue as we live as children of God throughout the rest of our lives, things that will make us different. Yeah, a lot of those are perspective changes. And so those two things are what we're going to look at here, the becoming phase and the living phase. And so the next section coming up here, we're going to talk about what happens when you become a child of God, when you become a Christian. And how does that change things for you, and how does that change your perspective with that? And then after that, we're going to look into the changes that happen and how you live out the rest of your life. So the first section is becoming children of God. And there's a verse here that I've got, and I'm sure you've read it many times, but there's something very odd about this verse. And I want you to kind of look at it and think to yourself, what's odd here? And you may remember so many times that I've said, when you're reading a verse, look to see if there's something odd about that verse that should make you ask, what is going on here? Or why is this being said? Or why is this being said right here in the text sometimes? So those kinds of questions are very good things to ask about when you're reading the Bible. And we recently saw a case there of Chance asked us a question about Jonah going overboard in the boat. That's a good question. That's one of those things when you're reading along, you say, well, something's odd here. Why isn't that? So when you have those questions and you can dig up the answers like that, you can often find more depth and understanding in what you're reading. And this verse here, or these two verses, in fact, have an oddity in them. So I want you to, as I read through this, I want you to listen for that and watch for that, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so for 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 20 through 21. Let every person continue in the calling in which he was called. If you have been called as a servant, let it not concern you. But if you can be freed, choose for yourself to do service. Now he's speaking to servants. The word used here is servant, but we would use the word slave. This is a person who is owned by another person. He doesn't have freedom of choice over what he does in his life. And so he's talking to those people who are slaves who have become Christians. And he's saying to them, continue in the calling in which you have been called. Can anyone see something odd in that? It's hard to see, I admit. Okay, I'll push on. The question to ask here is, why does Paul feel the need to say this? He's speaking, as I said, to new Christians who are slaves. He says, if you were a slave when you were called, you became a Christian, remain a slave. Otherwise, there is a way, if there is a way for you to be freed, then you should pursue that way to be free. But if you aren't able to be freed, then remain a slave and don't worry about it. So why is it odd? It's odd because why would he feel the need to say that? Why would a slave assume that now that I'm a Christian, I'm not a slave, and so I can just run off and ignore my master? And so that's the interesting thing here is that Paul feels it necessary to tell the slaves who have become Christians, remain slaves. And so obviously there is some reason that he believes that they would think, now that they're Christians, they're not slaves. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier. They see themselves as children of God and therefore as free. But he's telling them, essentially, yes, you're free as God sees you, but continue where you are. If you are a servant or a slave, then continue as a servant or slave, unless there is some way you can be free. But otherwise, continue as a servant or a slave, and don't let that concern you. But continue that way. And the reason is, as we know, what happens to slaves if they ran away from their owners. Their owners would often hunt them down and mistreat them for running away and punish them for running away. So he's saying much the same thing that we saw with the taxes when Jesus was talking about those. He said, we're going to pay the taxes, even though those taxes don't apply to us. We're going to pay those taxes so that it doesn't cause a big fuss and then people get thrown into jail and there's a whole bunch of trouble. We're going to go along with that. And so he's saying the same things for the slave. Remain a slave, because if you don't, it's going to cause nothing but trouble. And we're going to talk about that kind of trouble a little bit later on as we go through this as well. So we're seeing the same point here, that idea of something that changed when you became a child of God. And in this case, it's talking about slavery. As God sees you, you're no longer a slave. And remember that there were slaves for different reasons at that time. There were people who had voluntarily become slaves. Perhaps they'd gotten so far in debt that they needed to do that to pay the debt. Some of them were prisoners of war who had become slaves. There are many reasons that people might become slaves. Sometimes it was just that people who weren't really able to manage their lives needed someone who could take care of them, and they would do work for them. So they were more like a contractor in a sense that we have now, but they didn't have those sorts of things then. So these people were owned people, but for various reasons. And so their idea here as a Christian is, well, I'm free, therefore I shouldn't be a slave. And Paul is saying, no, it's necessary for you to continue unless you can, your owner will free you for some reason. So we see the same idea as we saw in the taxes there. The idea that the children of God are free.
It seems to me that Jesus was always trying to work within the system. He wasn't trying to start a revolution that it was worldly or physical. But he was all about spirituality, and of course that'll change in the coming kingdom, where he will completely redo everything. But for the spiritual kingdom he's trying to set up, he's trying to work within the confines and the organization that existed at that time. And I think some people didn't like that. I have a feeling the Jews wanted a physical kingdom, and they wanted him to kick everybody out and put them in charge, and it didn't work that way. And unfortunately for them, they misunderstood it. They didn't quite get that.
Yeah, that's all very good. And we'll talk about some of those same things as we move along here. But yes, in that time, Jesus could not have succeeded without working within the system. He would have encountered too heavy a resistance from the Romans, particularly from the Jews as well. And so it was, like you're saying, necessary for him to work within the system. And we see those things happening here. We've seen it with taxes, we're seeing it with slavery, and we'll see it in some other ways too. And so any other comments before we move on? Okay.
I'm sorry, my question was, why would that one person would like to remain slave? That's just my question.
He wouldn't. And that's really what's being addressed here, is that he's saying, although God sees you not as a slave anymore, God sees you as a free man, it's necessary for you to remain a slave. Otherwise, well, we'll talk about the otherwise some more. But he's not saying you would want to remain a slave. As a Christian, you should desire to be free, but sometimes that wasn't possible because of the agreements that they had entered into to become a slave.
I think you actually touched on it a little bit, but there was a a law back then that if you got into financial problems, that you had to work for somebody to work out the debt within 7 years. And that was an agreement that you have with that person. So how can you take that back? You know, it doesn't really work that way. You still owe the person that money, and you got to work it. So they forgive the debt after 7 years or so. In other cases, you know, as you mentioned there, people willingly turn themselves over to some people to take care of them because they just could not take care of themselves. And we have that in a socialist, you know, society where people depend on the government to take care of them because they either they can't or won't take care of themselves. So Jesus was not trying to change that, you know. It's not a good thing, but it is what it was. It was what it was, you know, as they say.
Yeah, and it's we have a little bit of a jaundiced view of slavery because of the black slavery that went on. But there were many people who were good owners of slaves and treated you well. So if you were having trouble running your life, it might not be such a bad idea to become a slave for a good-hearted owner, and for good families who would take care of you. That's not such a bad deal. But yeah, it was still sad in many ways because you would sometimes even have to sell off your children, make them slaves to pay debts or make up for whatever you had done. So it's not something anybody would really want to do, but circumstances would compel you to do it. Okay, so now we're going to get into the idea of a new man. And Paul talks about this in a couple places in the books that he wrote. And he also understood that from prior times. The Jews understood this new man idea in a different way than Christians do. We think of it more as a metaphorical new man, not as though you're really new in any way, but just thinking of yourself as new. But in this lesson here, I really want us to understand that we are new in ways that are important. And Paul knew that, and the Jews knew that. They knew that when a person becomes a believer, he becomes a new person, literally as God sees it. And so in Old Testament times, if you became a Jew, like you were a Gentile and then you became a Jew, you, as far as they were concerned, were a completely new person. The family you had before were no longer your family. The wife you had before was no longer your wife unless she converted with you and became a Jew as well. And so that idea of you had been baptized and changed into a new man, a new person, in a much more literal sense than we think of it nowadays, is how they understood that. And so if you converted into Judaism from being a Gentile, you became a person who no longer had any attachments to the world. Anything you might have committed to, anything you might have done or said, all of the people in your life that you had before, all of those bonds had been broken. And you were able to, once you had converted, to reestablish whichever ones of those you wanted to and continue with them on. But it wasn't necessary to do that. And so in Judaism, they had that concept in a much more firm way than we do. But we can see in some of the things that Paul says, that still exists for Christianity. And he talks about things like the old is dead and the new has come. And from that, we see the idea that we're no longer bound by any vows or commitments that we had made is when we were no longer or prior to becoming Christians. All of those things that we had committed to do, promises that we had made, bank loans that we had made, those sort of things. As God sees it, those are no longer bound on us. But we're still talking here about living in a reality of the world, and they don't see it that way. And so we're also no longer a member of the family that we were physically born into. And we can reestablish those bonds again if we want to. But all of those things, we've been broken from the world and freed from the world. And we're no longer part of that. And so that transition to becoming a Christian is, in God's eyes, a very big thing. In our practical lives, we don't see so much evidence of that, but we'll talk about a couple things. And so Paul again emphasizes the idea that the person that was you before has died. And this deals also with sins and other obligations. So that person who died before died with all of the sins that you had committed, and they're gone from you, and you're not obligated to anything anymore. And a new man has grown up and been brought up, and you are not that person. And so that also tells us something about how we should look back on our past life before we were a Christian. We still have those memories. We have this physical body that still has the memories of the person that we were before we were a Christian. And some of the things that we did, some of the things that we said, we regret. But we need to look back and say, that wasn't me. That was some other person. That person is gone. That person is dead. A new person is now, and that new person is being reformed as we go along and grow stronger in God. And so that outlook is what we're headed for, is the idea that that old man is gone and dead, and the new man is here, and we're building up the new man. And also the terms that you see in the Bible are ideas like a new person starting over and being born again. And so when you become a Christian, you are a very different person as God sees you. As I've been saying over and over again, you might not look so different in a mirror, but you are a different person as God sees you, and you should see yourself that way too, and understand yourself as being not just another man who now believes in something, but as a different person, a person who didn't exist before. And this perspective is what we're really looking for in this lesson, is understanding all of that perspective of how you are different from the world. And so one of the things that is different here is, and we've talked about it already, is God normally considers it important that we live up to our commitments and promises. God does the same thing himself. When he makes commitments and promises, he follows through on those things. And in fact, in one place in the Bible, he says, if I was to break my commitments, I would be a liar. And so the idea there is that when you make a commitment, you have told somebody something, and to not fulfill that commitment, it makes you a liar, which of course we don't want to be. So God, in the same way that he sees it important for himself to meet his commitments and promises, he sees it important for us too. So we shouldn't trivially enter into commitments that we aren't sure that we're going to be able to fulfill. And we need to be careful about that. And the Bible has a number of talks about that idea of making sure that we live up to our commitments when we make them, and not making commitments that we don't believe that we can live up to. So in this case here of when you become a child of God, those commitments are all broken, as we've been saying before. The commitments we made as a sinner prior to becoming a Christian are no longer binding on us. We made them as a foolish person, and now we're no longer that person, so we're not bound by the things that we did. And so God expects us to fit into the world, as we've been saying, to do our best to meet those commitments. But if we can't, then it's nothing to God if we have to break those commitments, because those commitments are actually not binding on us. They were made by a person before who is now dead, and the new person never made those commitments. He's just carrying them through. So I hope that that's making some sense to you in perspective terms about who you are. So we saw that with Jesus and Peter and the tax, the idea that we live in the physical world and where we choose to submit to authority because that's what God has asked us to do. And we know that they will enforce their laws. And so we might think, well, I've made a commitment to the bank to pay back this money. God says, it's not a big thing to him. But society is going to say, no, you need to pay that back, or else you need to declare bankruptcy. And there's a whole bunch of process associated with that. So we live a tough life, to be honest. We live a life for our God with his rules, and we live in a society that has different rules. And that is often going to complicate our lives. We're going to find that other examples as we go along here, and you're probably going to find that in your life many times, is that society expects things from you that you really shouldn't be doing or involved in. So this brings up the question of what happens if you break commitments like that in society. And we talked about that a little bit. Jesus said that so that we don't cause a big fuss here, we're going to pay off that tax. And so we asked the question as to what happens if all the people who became Christians stopped paying their mortgages and their loans and broke the agreements that they had made. Well, how would people view Christianity? They wouldn't think very much of Christians. So Christians would be despised among all of society. And Jesus faced the same thing, as Joe was saying. He had to work within society. And he did so because it was necessary to get out his message. Otherwise, the gospel message would not have spread. It would have been associated with people who break the law all the time. And the people who were doing that would have been thrown in jail. So it would have slandered the whole Christian message to have not worked with society or worked within society. And that was necessary for Jesus to do, and it was necessary for us to do as well. We need to fit into society ourselves so that we can also spread that gospel message. But the vows and the promises that we have made while we are a Christian are binding on us. And so if we, as a Christian, go to a bank and make a bank loan, the bank and God both expects us to honor that commitment. And so that's the difference there is when you become a Christian, those commitments which were made by the person who is dead are no longer binding. However, the ones that you make as a Christian, those are binding. And that should be obvious. Any questions on that?
Well, makes sense.
That Whataburger bag is catching my eye.
Sorry.
It's not that I'm hungry or anything. Okay. So family is another aspect of that. Jesus said something interesting that's really about this. He was speaking with a bunch of people, as he often did, as he traveled around spreading the gospel message. And a man, and while he was in a house surrounded by a bunch of people, a man came to him and said, "Behold, your mother and your brother are standing outside and want to speak with you." But Jesus answered and said to him, told him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" So again, here we see this idea of spiritual and physical. He's saying, yeah, it's my physical mother and brothers who are asking for my attention. But here I am with the people who are really my mother and my brothers. And he continues on, and he stretches his hands toward his disciples, points towards his disciples, and said, "Behold, my mother, and behold, my brothers. For everyone who does the will of my Father who is in heaven, the same is my brother and my sister and my mother." So again, we're seeing this idea of a spiritual family and a physical family. And obviously his first allegiance is to his spiritual family, which is God, his allegiance to God, of course. And so, but later on, we'll see that he does go to meet with his family, but because he has this perspective correct, that God's family comes first, he's dealing with them first, and later on he'll deal with his physical family. And this is kind of the thing that we get stuck with many times, because we have to live as children of God in a society of godless people, is that we have dual commitments that we have to balance off, trade off, and find a way to meet them, with the perspective that God's things comes first and then society's things come second. And that can often put us into very difficult situations. And as I said, that results in a complicated family. Your family is made out of both spiritual components and physical components. The physical components being the ones that you were born with or born from, and your brothers and sisters, and the spiritual ones being all of God's family, all of the Holy Spirit connected family that we're in. So what we see in these two verses is that the family of Jesus are trying to use their positions as mother and brothers to get Jesus to stop doing what he is doing. They don't understand what he's doing. They don't understand what he's teaching. And they don't see that he is trained to be a teacher of the law or a Pharisee or anything like that. He hasn't gone through the normal path they would expected him to go through. He was raised as a carpenter's son, and he learned carpentry, and then he started off going around teaching things like that. So they're confused about this, and they think that because we are your mother and your brothers, you should come out and talk to us and get this fixed and address this problem. But he is, like I was saying before, he's caught between honoring his mother, like one of the commandments, and obeying God, another one of the commandments. So, so priority says he has to obey God first and then honor his mother later. And God wins, of course, in that decision. And so we in our lives are going to be faced with the same kind of situation, where we are a child of God living in a godless society, and we have to find some way to fit into society and make things work to the benefit of God. Marriage is another aspect that gets touched on because of this change when you become a child of God. The verse that we're going to look at here, I forgot to quote where it comes from, but if someone wants, I can provide that, or maybe I did later. No, I never. Okay, and it says, and whichever wife has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to stay with her, let her not leave her husband. But if he who does not believe separates, let him separate. A brother or sister is not in bondage in these such cases. God has called us to peace. And so Paul is saying here something that might seem a little strange, because if we remember what Jesus said about divorce, he said it's only allowed in the cases of adultery. But he's saying here, if you have an unbelieving spouse and the unbelieving spouse wants to separate, says, I can't stand your religion, I can't stand you, I don't want to have anything to do with it, and he separates, divorces, goes away from you, Paul is saying, whatever, it doesn't matter. You're not in bondage. You're not tied to that person. And again, this comes to the idea that as we became children of God, that old man died who had been married, and now the marriage that you have, you're continuing on, as we've been talking about so many things, continue on fitting into society, paying taxes, continuing as a slave. That same idea we're seeing here again is continuing in on that marriage, but the marriage isn't binding. If the other spouse says, I don't want any part of this, and walks away, then it's not a thing. God doesn't see you as being a sinner because you've broken that marriage. In other cases, for example, if two Christians married, then it would be a problem. But in this case, because the old man died and the new man is here, the new man has just kind of stepped into a role, inherited a role, and he's not bound by it. Where Jesus said divorce is only allowed in cases of adultery, we see what looks like Paul's saying something else, but he really isn't. We see that he's talking about a special case here where there's an unbelieving spouse as a result of a conversion of a person. So one of the people in the marriage has become a child of God. The other person doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And that's the situation. So the special situation that Paul is talking about here is a result of somebody becoming a Christian. So normally, marriage, which is joined by God, is broken only by death. And we think of that as a physical death. But he also is talking about a spiritual death here. The spiritual death of the old man has also broken the marriage that was there. And God's interest in the marriage is now gone. It's something you can pick up again, and you generally should, unless the other spouse has no interest in that. But in many cases, and Paul talks about that exact situation, he says, if that spouse is still not a believer, but will still stay with you, then stay with that spouse. Perhaps you will convert that person. And so that's, again, the gospel message, fitting into society, that we can still keep the gospel message going.
I think it's important to remember that we should stay within the authorities that are over us. But if there ever is a conflict between the authority and God, then the choice has to be in favor of God. Yep. In this case, he's simply saying the same thing. If he's an unbeliever, but he's not holding you back from believing, well, maybe you should stay with him. But if he's giving you too much of a problem and you can't really serve the Lord, then he's come between you and God. And nobody can come between us and God. And God has got to have priority in every case, whether it's a spouse, family, our job, or even our leadership. God always has to come first. Yeah,
that's good to hear. And I'll read that last part of that verse again. It says, God has called us to peace. And so in this situation where there's an unbelieving spouse who is interfering with your life and doesn't want to have anything to do with it, or in fact has just walked away from you, God has called us to peace. Don't worry about this. It's not a problem because the old man died. You weren't in bondage for this marriage anymore. Okay, now I've used up quite a bit of time. I have a few more slides. I think maybe we should leave that till next week. Yeah, that would be good. But so next week, we'll look at the idea of living as children of God. So far, we've been just looking at the idea of what happens when you become a child of God, when you convert and become a Christian. And so next week, we'll be looking at how life is different and how your perspective is different as you live in this world as a child of God.